China columnist with the Financial Times and also author of Generation Hong Kong, Seeking Identity in China's Shadow. On the line, we have Helen Sham Ho, who's a Hong Kong-born senior consultant with the China-Australia Legal Exchange Foundation and a former member of the New South Wales Parliament. And also on the line, Feng Chongyi, who's associate professor in China Studies at the University of Technology in Sydney. Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, morning. Perhaps Ben Bland first. Your newspaper's been reporting a lot on this issue lately between China and Hong Kong. What's going on?
Well, I think there are a number of issues, but I think, first of all, it's important to point out two perceptions which turned out to actually be misperceptions, which I think are at the heart of a lot of what's been happening between China and Australia and also China and many other places in the world. So the first perception is that over time China would become a more open society socially and politically, and this was a perception that was held until recently both within China and outside, and of course in Hong Kong too. And the second perception was that engagement by the outside world, whether it was Hong Kongers, Western companies, Australian politicians, that process of engagement would accelerate and facilitate the opening of China. And actually, as it's happened, both of those perceptions have turned out to be wrong. So under Xi Jinping, China has been becoming more closed politically and socially. And also China has taken the things it wants from engagement with the outside world, investment, technology, access to some education. But it's also rejected those things that it doesn't want at the same time.
And what does China want from Australia?
Well, I think what's been happening in Australia is a function of the wider mission by China's United Front, the division within the Communist Party that's meant to engage with all those outside the party, both inside China and in the rest of the world. And I think there's been a very clear mission to both promote China's interests all around the world and also to point out and attack its enemies, particularly on core issues like Taiwan, obviously Hong Kong now as well, and the South China Sea. So I think what we've seen in Australia, where there have been a number of cases of local politicians and others who've been taking funding from Chinese-Australian business people with links in the end back to the United Front, I think that's an example of the wider influence mission from the Chinese Communist Party, which is happening all around the world, actually, not just in Australia.
Is there anything unusual, though, or untoward in this? I'm just thinking that you say China's promoting its own interest. Every country naturally promotes its own interest, and I'm sure there are business associations. There's the Peru-Greece business association. Every two countries have these kind of links. Is this special in any way?
There's two important points to make here. The first is, yes, you're totally right, Hugh. Many, many countries try and influence their perception overseas. Britain has the BBC, America has the VOA, every country has a foreign ministry and business associations. So on that point, you're totally right. I think the key point in China's case is that we have a one-party state here where there's a unity between the party, the government, civil servants, even foreign businesses now being sucked into the orbit and control of the Communist Party within China. So you're dealing with a much more sort of calcified and strong United Party, whereas British Business Association overseas may not necessarily agree with what the government's doing. It's certainly not being directed by the government. So I think that's the first point. The second point is I think what we're seeing now is more a question for the rest of the world about how it reacts to China. Obviously, it's China's sovereign right to manage its foreign policy as it sees fit, but it's a question for Australia, Canada, Britain, but also, Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam, to decide how do they deal with these Chinese efforts to promote their interests, sometimes in open ways, but often in secretive ways, because as we know, the Chinese Communist Party is a Leninist Marxist organisation, and much of what it does is deliberately done behind closed doors.
Okay, Helen Sham Ho, former member of the New South Wales Parliament. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So how do you perceive this situation?
Well, perhaps slightly different from Ben. I think the perception is true. Politics is all about perception. But it's in real terms, China has been a friend to, or we have diplomatic relations since 45 years ago. We're just celebrating the relationship this year. And so far since then, we have good relationship, and the relationship has been improving all these years, as far as I can see. Particularly since perhaps former Prime Minister John Howard's days, it had been non-stop until perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, when President Xi came to Australia and established the free trade agreement with our Prime Minister Tony Abbott. I think since then we never looked back. Our relations have been very good. It wasn't a perception. It is not a misperception either. It is actually for real, and we have enjoyed prosperity, good relationship between the two countries. So I think this is true. I cannot say it's not true because I go to Hong Kong all the time, I go to China all the time, and of course I've been here for over 50 years in Australia and haven't been a legislator myself. I think it's very important that China and Australia are good economic partners, if not nothing else. To me, I think the difficulty at this point of time for China and Australia is perhaps their alliance with USA. I think there was a difficulty I think our current Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, is facing at this stage, because we have to have a very sensible and sensitive balance between these two big powers in this world, because both are important to our country. I mean, Australia, I mean, China and America are important to us. Of course, with America, we have the NSEC. We are alliance, so we have to have our loyalty. It's supposed to be a military protection or security, relying on America. However, as I was saying, for economic and for other reasons like social, apart from economic, is education and people to people. We have to be very sensitive about China's help, in my perspective, to Australia's prosperity in future. And so far up till now, it is important for both countries to be more harmonious than be at lockerhead, actually.
That sounds a little like a veiled threat. We have to be more sensitive about China's contribution to Australia's prosperity in the future.
I'm sorry, say that again.
It sounds like a little bit like a threat. You're saying that Australia's prosperity might be endangered in future?
Well, I would say so, because we are very dependent on China at this stage economically. No doubt, for our biggest export of education, for example, is from Chinese students. Our minerals and our tourism, they are all increased many folds in the last 10, 20 years. I think we have to look after our well-being as well. I'm sure China will have the same view, because they are growing very fast. In fact, I think Australia is lagging behind a little to China at this point of time. So I think it's not a threat at all. It's just a mutual benefit.
I mean,
and of course, it's important to have this mutual understanding and mutual cooperation.
Okay, should we bring in Feng Chongyi, who's Associate Professor in China Studies at the University of Technology in Sydney. Good morning.
Good morning.
So relations between China and Australia have been very good, very strong for a number of years now, as we were just talking about, very important trading partners. But do you see any change taking place now in that relationship? We have the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull talking about unprecedented and increasingly sophisticated attempts to influence the political process in Australia, and citing disturbing reports about Chinese influence.
Yes, it is. I think I have to disagree with Helen in support of that, in the judgment of the current situation. The relationship between China and Australia, or between any two countries, are not only trade. It involves political values, institutions, security, and other areas as well. I think the Turnbull's proposal for new legislation of governing the foreign influence in Australia is overdue law that should have happened long ago. I mean, in China, as Ben mentioned, that is the regime type method. It's a Leninist state. It has operated the United Front strategy over the world, and since Xi Jinping came to power, it actually launched an ideological war against universal values and constitutional democracy. And Australia become a battle ground in that case, especially within the Chinese community here. I mean, the strategy itself is, of course, is aimed to cause division and disintegration of the opposite side. In this case, it's the liberal or democratic force in Australia, and then cause a lot of trouble within the Australian society as well as Chinese communities here.
Yes, because there are more than 1 million Chinese Australians. What effect is it having on the Chinese Australian community and their relations with the rest of Australia?
Yes, well, I have been living here for over 2 decades. I have witnessed the change since the last 1 decade or so, that you see the Chinese the media, the local media in Chinese, and the Chinese associations, now almost all of them, 90% of them have become pro-communist. That they, if we to get it quite right, point out, it's almost work as the proxy of Chinese communist power. And Chinese communist power in this sense have been very successful to use its economic power and market opportunity as an effective leverage to co-op those patriotic Chinese community leaders, as well as some of the politicians and business people in politics and business in Australia.
Helen Shum, would you like to respond to that?
I can't really hear Professor Fang terribly well. I can only see bits and pieces of it to say that the media was very much pro-Chinese communists. And I didn't hear the last part of it.
What about that point about the media?
Oh, well, that is hard to tell. I mean, I don't read the Chinese media very much myself, I have to say. But according to the beginning, they were saying that there was 1 million Chinese here. And as a legislator myself in the past, I think it's important as a democratic and a multicultural society in Australia, we have to have more voice in Australia, because the fact that, you have more people, you should have more voice. That is my important point I think I have to put through to people, that if Chinese community wanted more political power, so be it. This is to be expected in a democratic society, that they can have more powerful voice. I don't think there's anything to be frowned on, because it's the right thing to do in a democracy. Don't you think?
So what do you? Ben Bland, do you want to respond to that?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Well, I think it's not. I don't think it's about.
I can't hear Professor Fang very well.
Okay.
He seems to have a very soft voice from my end.
I don't think it's just about a voice for Chinese people. I mean, I think the concerns in Australia and elsewhere are about the Chinese Communist Party's influence operations. And I think actually listening to much of what Professor Feng said, it actually struck a chord and will strike a chord with many people in Hong Kong. This kind of war for values, pressure on sort of the Western democratic values, the use of sort of economic treats, both to win support and also to threaten other people that if, you can't work with the way the Communist Party wants things to be, you're going to lose out economically. So I think there's a very interesting comparison there. And as one professor said recently in the hearing before US Congress on this very issue, China's not so much going after hearts and minds as wallets. And I think Professor Feng was onto a key point there about the use of economic power to attract as well as to threaten.
Well, can I just respond to that? Because if the Communist Party is doing it covertly in Australia, then we can't see it. There haven't been very much report in the Western media until perhaps in recent times that it has been implication or reflection of their activities. But in terms of influence in Australia, overtly, I cannot see anything. We're talking about political donations, even talking about Mr. Wang Xiaomao, that has been the focus of all these political donations. All the Australian people and the government wants is more transparency. I don't think they necessarily single out China is the culprit. I think it is common to all other countries where it's not specific to one country like China. It so happened we have a local by-election in the last period of time, the last perhaps 6-8 weeks, and I think somehow the international diplomacy and foreign policy has been slightly muddled up with the local politics of the by-election. I think that's not quite fair for Professor Fang to actually openly say it is the Communist Party at work in this sphere. No doubt, in all countries, I think we all realize that countries would have wanted to be more or less more informed about their policies, or can, if any country wants to influence another country, we all do that. I think we can see in the United Nations or anywhere in the world. I'm sure America will want to influence our policy as well. But it depends on how it's being done, I suppose. And if there is covert activities, I think it is only slightly to me is a perception. No doubt, because of the activity of the Consul General and the Embassy too, Consul General and the Embassy, how they actually respond, how profile they are making themselves in the public, because when they are representing a big group of nationals here, of course they are more active. So I believe that in recent days, actually, the embassy has sent out warnings to their overseas students to be careful about all these attacks, physical attacks, and all these anti-Chinese sentiment posters and things like this. So it all depends on how they are working overtly and covertly that you can claim such perception, I should say.
Okay, the Chinese media and indeed the Foreign Ministry has had strong words for Malcolm Turnbull: historical, racist, paranoia, a lack of principle, pandering to irresponsible reports. Do you agree with China on that? Is he being racist?
So. I think our Prime Minister is a very principled person, but as I was explaining, it was very much a local thing, and it so happened the senator, the former senator now, Sam Cesari, was actually mixed up with Chinese personalities. So, in fact, it just focused on the Chinese community at that time.
Well, hang on. I mean, you have really quite sharply opposed kind of takes on this from Malcolm Turnbull and from China, from Beijing. Who do you agree with?
Sorry, say that again.
Who do you agree with, Malcolm Turnbull or Beijing?
Well, at this point of time, yes, Beijing was correct, actually, because there has been more or less anti-Chinese.
You think Malcolm Turnbull's statements were hysterical? They were racist, paranoia?
No, I think he was trying to be local politically biased there. He just taking opportunists, I should say, not biased. I think he was just using it because it was a very highly densely populated Chinese electorate in that by-election.
Well, if I can come in here, I mean, I don't think this is just a local issue. I mean, the US Congress has just held a hearing on China's influence operations overseas. We know that the Five Eyes security partners, which is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US and the UK, yes, have also shared their fears about Chinese Communist Party influence operations. So while there obviously is local political issues as well, there's clearly a global concern in the major Western democracies about this issue. You know, rightly or wrongly, there's a real concern there, and it's not just in Australia.
Sure. I have no qualm about that because I'm not privileged to those secret agents' information.
Okay, Feng Chongyi, let's go back to you. We've had this warning, as we just heard there, for students coming from Chinese authorities, from the embassy, whatever, saying Chinese students in Australia should watch out. Is that justified, do you think? Do you think they're under threat? And why is that? And what can you do about it?
No, it's opposite, actually. I mean, the proposed new law or the other discussion here is not targeting the Chinese student or Chinese community in any sense. It actually is the as I said, is an overdue measure to deal with the Chinese Communist Party influence in Australia. And the influence has been exercised to the extent that one Chinese Communist Party promotes illiberal, undemocratic.
I think, Professor Feng, the point would be whether that concern about the influence of China is turning into personal animosity, into racism on the streets, because you have this this warning, as I say, this direct warning for the safety of Chinese students in Australia, apparently.
That's what I'm going to say. If down the track, if the Chinese Communist Party exercises power in this way, influence in this way, it will have negative impact on the Australian society. It may provoke a resentment. That is my concern, yeah.
So you think that resentment is real? You think the threat is real? You think that students... do you see this on campus? So, I mean, you're working on the front line as an academic. Do you see harassment? Do you see discrimination against Chinese students in Australia? And if you do, that's despicable. We should be doing something about that.
No, I haven't seen that. I just said that there's potential if this Chinese Communist influence has not been managed well.
That sounds like a threat, a little bit. That sounds like a threat from you.
Yeah, if you take it that way. Because this, of course, if you look at the history, if the Chinese Communist Party exercises its influence, it provokes resentment from the whole society and will have negative impact on the Chinese community in the whole society.
Okay, well, thanks, everybody. We're going to have to take a short break for the news at 9 o'clock, but we'll be back at 3 minutes past. We're talking this morning about China's concerns about China's involvement in Australia. You can email us at backchat@rthk.hk. That's backchat@rthk, or go to our Facebook page, Backchat on RTHK Radio 3. Leave a comment there, or give us a call on 233 88 266. Quick look at the weather. It's going to be fine and very dry, and the outlook is for temperatures rising in the next couple of days, mainly fine with cool mornings during the Christmas holidays. Currently it's 13 degrees, humidity 47%.
That the reforms will add $1.5 trillion to the US deficit. You're listening to the news on RTHK.
And welcome back to Backchat with Hugh Chiverton and me, Jim Gould. This morning we're talking about concerns about China's involvement in Australia. Australia's drafting a new law to ban foreign political donations. Beijing has accused Australia of bias in this. We have several guests with us, but before we reintroduce our guests, we've got a Facebook comment from Henry Young. Henry writes that the Australian-Chinese embassy has issued a safety warning to Chinese people in Australia, referring to a number of insults and beatings that Chinese students have suffered recently, underlines the seriousness of the situation. The anti-Chinese pro-US Australian foreign policy white paper, the Australian PM Turnbull commenting in Chinese that Australia has stood up. Huawei, Zhongxing, the Chinese telecom companies facing a ban in Australia, all highlight the strong anti-Chinese sentiment. brewing up a sort of McCarthyism. This is not surprising given that Australia depends on the US for security and its relationship with the US. The white Australian policy, though abolished decades ago, still resides in many Australians' minds. Australia has earned billions from Chinese students in Australia, Chinese tourists and mineral sales to China. I find it surprising that in this global age, Australia still displays this attitude. Turnbull's statement defying China implies that China has bullied Australia for years and naturally has stoked up more anti-Chinese sentiment. It only shows his lack of statesmanship and inability to have an international relationship viewpoint without racial prejudice. I think Chinese tourists, students and investors would think twice before going to Australia for study, tourism or investment. Other countries offer many more better choices. China is unlikely to take any drastic measures against Australia. I think Australia will sooner or later regret their actions as China continues its development, just like Norway did in the Nobel Prize to the Liu Xiaobo episode. The new approach, sorry, the rest of Henry's message is about another shorter topic that we're doing at the end of the programme. I think we have an email as well.
The email comes from Matthew, who says, I'm impressed by the way the Australian government has bravely stood up on this issue. The over-the-top reaction from the CCP makes it clear this was needed and has hit the spot. The cries of racism totally miss the mark as these measures target highly organised interference by the CCP and its united front and are not about Chinese people either in Australia or elsewhere. Although the CCP wants to confuse us into believing CCP China and the Chinese people are one thing, they most certainly are not. Most people of Chinese heritage in Australia have chosen Australia because they prefer democracy over dictatorship and want this protected. It's best that the CCP and its United Front proxies understand this rather than getting too confident and overreaching in their rhetoric and actions. Last week on our own Backchat, we even had the so-called China-Australia Legal Exchange Foundation claiming Australia's political system is a two-party dictatorship in order to explain China's one-party dictatorship. That thought comes from Matthew.
OK, well, we have with us this morning Ben Bland, the South China correspondent for the Financial Times, Helen Shum Ho, who's a Hong Kong-born senior consultant with the China-Australia Legal Exchange Foundation and a former member of the New South Wales Parliament, Feng Chongyi, Associate Professor in China Studies at the University of Technology in Sydney, and we're also joined now on the line by Mobo Gao, who's a professor at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Adelaide and author of the Battle of China's Past, Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Professor Gao, good morning to you.
Good morning.
How about that comment that we just heard, that most people of Chinese heritage in Australia have chosen to live there because they prefer democracy over dictatorship?
That's a group thinking statement. I'm sure some people would like to live in Australia for the clean air and the sunny beaches instead of politics.
What do you think of this situation? Malcolm Turnbull's comments about disturbing reports about Chinese influence, Australia's move to ban foreign political donations, require lobbyists to make a declaration if they're acting on behalf of overseas parties and so on. How's the situation at the moment as you see it?
I think a law to have a law banning donation, foreign donation, I think is a good thing. But the thing is whether you have a double standard there, just to ban the Chinese and not the other foreign powers.
Well, presumably the overseas donations law would apply to donations from anywhere overseas, not just China.
Well, if that's the case, that'd be good. I welcome that. And also, I think there should be a law banning donations from the capitalists. I mean, if you look at the issue there, a businessman in Australia who is ethnic Chinese, so-called, donated to both parties. The business people do that for their own business benefit. He was not doing it for the Chinese government, I don't think.
Sorry, did you say you contrasted China and the capitalists?
No, I mean, there are capitalists, the business people want to donate to politicians for their own benefit, whether they're Chinese or not.
Okay, so right. So you're saying the logic would imply that you would not allow Australian business people to donate to political parties.
Yes. The party politics in West democracy is corrupted because of the donation from the business, from the big money.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you see signs that Beijing is trying to exert influence? That it's using the United Front, as we've heard suggested, to exert influence in the academic field, in the political field, in the economic field on Australia? That it's targeting change in Australia and seeking to influence Australia deliberately and consciously?
Well, as a general statement. Any country tries to influence other countries. That's what they call soft power, whatever you call it. And as a general statement, I don't doubt the Chinese government wants to do that as well. But if you come to details in the particular cases, what is reported in the media doesn't have much evidence. It's all speculation.
Right. Ben Bland, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think in general there is evidence for a number of these things. I mean, you've talked about the donations, and that's one issue. But we know in Australia and elsewhere around the world, there's also the issue of Chinese students' associations and the fact that the embassies and consulates are taking a strong role in managing and leading them. And that those students are often pressuring professors and universities in terms of which speakers are allowed to come on campus, the words they can use to describe Taiwan and other issues deemed sensitive by the Chinese Communist Party. So I think it's not just a question of political donations, and we see this in other areas, and there's a real challenge for universities and others who obviously want to attract Chinese students, partly for the huge amount of money they bring, of course, but also because they want to really engage with China. But I think the problem is a lot of Western institutions were very naive about how China would engage with them, and they're only now starting to realise. So that's why we have this situation where there's a sudden realisation, and then there's fears on the other side of a backlash that could spark racism. Because I think there was a lot of naivety, and as Western governments, and not just Western, but Asian governments too, and universities, educational institutions think about this, they'll have to come up with better strategies for how to engage with China without compromising or threatening their core principles.
Professor Gao?
Well, I'm not sure that it's reasonable to claim that the universities and the administrations that want to engage with China are naive. And it's interesting, the commentators, the so-called intellectual scholars and academics, all think they are the wise ones, they know everything, and these people who are doing the actual work are naive. I'm not sure that is a reasonable statement.
Well, if you take the example recently of Cambridge University Press, which is one of the world's oldest and most famous academic publishers, part of Cambridge University, they were asked by their Chinese partner to start censoring content in China. They started doing it without thinking about it. There was a huge outcry and they reversed course. And I think that's just a classic example of the challenge. I mean, they saw a big market opportunity in China. When they were threatened by an agent of the Chinese state, they suddenly recoiled, thinking we could lose access to this huge market. And then there was a backlash because they'd compromised on their values, and then they had to think again. So if even Cambridge University, one of the world's oldest, hasn't worked out its position on how to deal with the Chinese Communist Party in China, I think it's probably quite likely that other institutions are struggling too.
Feng Chong-yi, you're at the University of Technology in Sydney. Have you experienced any direct influence from China on the way that the university goes about its business?
I will not comment things at my university, but as a general observation, that I can see clearly the fact that the Chinese Communist influences in Australia have been generate the effect that it's self-censorship very strongly in order not to offend China, to the effect that it's to shut down those political voice in the Chinese media, in academic community, or even in other business or political forums, to shut down those political voice against human rights violation or illiberal practice in China or Chinese communist activities around the world. That is a simple fact.
Helen Shum, have you experienced that?
No, I don't think so. In fact, if I make a general statement, I agree with Ben for what he said. University is supposed to have freedom of thinking, freedom of words, freedom of discussion, and if there are interference of anybody being matter, maybe because there are more Chinese students and there are more people undertaking Chinese studies, so the focus is actually on the Chinese somebody or whoever it might be, United Front or Communist Party, whoever, could have, I'm not doubting that, could have influence on that restriction or that change of words and change of paragraph, whatever. It could happen. I'm no doubt about that. But whether it is actually the Communist Party instigated it, that I don't know. But I heard that. I think that's wrong for whoever country, China or otherwise. I don't think we should change history or change what university is teaching. There should be no interference, period. So this is my personal view. I have no experience whatsoever.
If I could jump in here just to clarify a bit further, I think it does, to some extent, come down to a clash of values. I think in many democratic countries, universities, the media are seen as sort of great things to build societies, to have open debates, etc. From a Leninist, Marxist and Chinese Communist Party perspective, universities, the press, these are battlegrounds for ideological warfare. Sure. And, that's stated in Communist Party documents. That's not a secret. So I think there's a real clash of values that's happening here, and countries have to decide if they want to do business with China, how are they going to react, given that China does have such different values.
Professor? Well, so far so good between China and Australia. Surely the interaction between different sectors and different level of people, the clashing is minimal as far as I can see up to now. Perhaps now it has been highlighted. I think I can agree with that point, that there is certain clashes of understanding of culture, because as a Chinese, speaking as a Chinese, there are a lot of cultural practices that are not quite understood by the Australians, for example. So that's why I've been suggesting and perhaps actually campaigning for more interaction between the Chinese community here and the political parties. Actually, I actually suggested that they should have more understanding in the cultural sense, as suggested by Ben. The culture, there is definitely a clash at this moment of time in Australia.
Okay, Professor Gao, isn't this really down to Xi Jinping? Isn't that what's changing now, is the unique role of Xi Jinping? You know that he's taking to himself an incredible amount of power, and that he's very, very interested in tightening control, tightening debate in the media, in universities, and so on. And he's also very interested in projecting Chinese power globally. This is Xi Jinping's in action. This is what we're seeing happening in Australia.
Okay. I don't know how much Xi Jinping is directly involved in this, but anyway.
Well, he is. He's directly involved in everything that the Chinese government does.
Since Xi Jinping came to power, China is seen to be more threatening.
It is more threatening. It is more threatening. Yeah, you just look at the build-up of the Navy. You look at what's happening in the South China Sea. That's not a matter for argument, really, is it? Whether you call it threatening or whether you call it projecting power in a more positive kind of way. It is playing a larger part in the global slate. This is part of Xi Jinping thought. That's undeniable. Yep. The point is that whether what we're seeing in Australia is just kind of a symptom of that.
Yep. But let's come back to Ben's point of a clash of values. I think that's a good point. So when Xi Jinping comes to hold the power more firmly, China seems to be more threatening because not only because of what he said, but also because China seems to be going to be stable and even more intolerant of dissent. So that kind of value is very threatening to the West. That's why Australia and Western countries have become more alarmed. But so this is not a matter of freedom of speech, because why, for instance, if the teachers can express their views about whatever China, why can't the students express their views that is different? If the students from China express their views that is different from the lecturers, that should be allowed as well. So you can't just allow the politically correct speech, the freedom, not the politically incorrect speech or freedom. So so there is a clash of values. That's very important that we have to point out. So the values that are expressed by Xi Jinping's China are not welcome in the West. That's why I come to this issue. It's not a matter of the Chinese government try to interfere the freedom in the Western countries or academics on campus. It's just what is considered politically incorrect.
Okay, that's a kind of false equivalency, though, because what you're talking about in China is, as you know, is a united front policy. This is a stated aim, and that power is unified, and there is one line to take on a large number of issues, a large number of important issues, sensitive issues.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like the increase of political repression in China either. And I think the jury is still out. At the moment, Xi Jinping wants to concentrate the power to implement the policies. Otherwise, it's like during the era of Hu Jintao and the policies cannot be implemented because the different groups. Okay,
well, you can talk about the motivation, but you admit there is increasing political repression. Your words in China at the moment.
Yes, there is. Yes.
So what we're seeing in Australia a reaction to that being exported to that part of the world?
Well, that's fair enough. But the thing is, if you look at the foreign influence, China has hardly any. I mean, at the moment, they might be trying to influence the so-called ethnic Chinese community, but that is not even effective. If you really think of foreign influence, do I have to name them in Australia?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, but I don't want to name them. Because you know and I know, everybody knows. Mm. What is the strongest foreign influence in the West or in the whole world?
Let me put it like this. Do you feel free to say anything you like about Xi Jinping? Could you be really critical of Xi Jinping, for example?
Oh, of course I feel. That's what I said. I said increase of political repression in China.
Okay.
I mean, I think Professor Gao is
right.
And
what I'm not afraid, what I do want to exercise self-censorship, it's about certain countries, certain cultures. I really exercise self-censorship, not China.
Okay, Ben Bland, you were going to say?
Yeah, I think what Professor Gao is right about in a way is that we are just in the early days, actually, of China's overseas influence. So he's right in a way that this is a small issue at the moment compared to what it's likely to be in coming years. And I think for many countries and companies and places, it is not so much about the pressure they feel specifically, but the fear of missing out on the Chinese market. I think that's a large part of the soft power pull that China exerts on people. And some of that is real. There's obviously a lot of money to be made in China. And some of it is obviously also exaggerated by the Chinese Communist Party to make people feel that they can't survive without the Chinese market. Actually, many companies, when they do business in China, find it difficult to make profits in a way. And if you look at the Australian example, something like 30% of their exports go to China, but actually only about 5% of their GDP comes from those exports. But there's definitely a huge sense in Australia that they would, shrivel and die economically if it weren't for China.
Okay, well, Ben Bland, thanks very much. I think we have to wrap up the discussion there. We've got one more comment.
One more email, thank you, from Fergus. It says, forget Australia, it's just a talking point, a sideshow. Look at how China has bought off Africa, or large portions of it. Many column inches have gone into Russian interference in the US elections. China is playing the same game worldwide. That comes from Fergus.
Okay, well, thanks very much to our guests this morning. Ben Bland, South China correspondent with the Financial Times. Thank thanks also to Helen Sham Ho, Hong Kong-born senior consultant with the China-Australia Legal Exchange Foundation, Feng Chong Yi, associate professor in China Studies at the University of Technology in Sydney, and also to Mobo Gao, professor at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Adelaide. Thank you all.